This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Culver, and I'm the Director of Research here at the IIEA in Dublin. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to this very important and exciting discussion on the UK in a changing world with Anand Menon from UK in a Changing Europe. I only want to give one bit of health warning before handing over to Professor Katie Hayward. It's merely to say we're meeting in roundtable format today. This is for the speakers and also to those afterwards during the questions. Please aim anything you say at these devices that are looking at you around the table. If someone from down the table, Katie, asks a question, you may relay it to the little box if that's possible. Without further ado, on to you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Barry. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Katie Hayward, and I'll be chairing today's session. For those of you who I don't already know, I'm Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast and a member of the UK Working Group here at the Institute. And I should say from the beginning as a disclaimer that I worked with Anand at UK and Changing Europe during Brexit, and we remain friends. We thought back then in those innocent days that a changing Europe was already plenty enough change and flux to manage. Little did we know what was coming down the line. Today's event looks at the UK in a changing world. And of course, no state is immune from the effects of the New World Disorder, but there are particular challenges for the UK, which is confronting a series of interlinked challenges, of which the Brexit fallout is but a part. There are a few experts better than Anand to explain what these challenges are and how they interact. It's worth being founding director of UK and Changing Europe, Anand Menon is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. He's an Associate Fellow of Chatham House and is Senior Associate Member of Nuffield College, Oxford. He's also co-editor of the journal West European Politics. He is a prolific writer and commentator with an exceptional gift for making heavyweight and up-to-date expertise not only accessible but engaging. It's said in the notes that I was given in my briefing notes that he is a frequent contributor to the media on matters relating to British relations with the EU. But having seen and heard him on such BBC programmes as Have I Got News For You and the News Quiz, we can safely say that his contributions have ranged far beyond the Brexit, and we are all the richer for it. Before Anand delivers his opening remarks, a few housekeeping points. So the lecture and the Q&A are all on the record. Anand's lecture will be about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes,
about 20 minutes, after which I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll move from moderated to Q&A. If you're online, please use that Q&A function to submit questions and it'll be monitored. And then please just remember, if you're online or in the room when submitting a question, just to give your name and affiliation, please. With that, I will hand over to you, President.
Thank you very much indeed, Katie. Thank you all for joining, both here in the room and online. Oh, good, I was going to say, other slides appearing. The slides are appearing. So, I've been accused about 3 times today of being incredibly negative, pessimistic and depressing when I talk about the United Kingdom. And I think that will probably continue for the next 20 minutes. But what I would say, I'd say in my defence that actually, whilst the United Kingdom faces a huge number of problems, and I'm going to try and look at what those problems are today, I don't think the situation is hopeless. I think, and I hope we can get to this in the Q&A, that there are solutions to the problem we face. And if that isn't enough to cheer you up, what I would say to you, particularly if you're British and listening to this and getting depressed, just keep saying to yourself, at least we're not France. So, the challenges take many forms, the challenges that we confront, and some of them stem from outside our borders. And there are 2 sorts of challenges from outside our border. One is growing geopolitical instability, the greater prevalence of conflict, which you can see in the table on the left. The second is rising US tariffs, which you can see in the graph on the right. What I should say on the graph on the right is, whilst obviously in the 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were far higher than anything we see today, back in the 1930s, the US didn't trade that much with the outside world, so their impact on the global trading system was relatively small. The impact of Trump and that significant, though small-looking rise that you see right on the end is far greater because the US economy is far more open to world trade than it was then. And of course, one of the problems with Trump is that you can't keep up with his tariffs. The FT, I think, is the best place to do it. They have a Trump tariff tracker that basically changes daily. as some measures seem to have been forgotten, other things that were agreed are not implemented. It's a real movable feast. And the problem for the United Kingdom is we are a small, open economy, and the US is our second largest trading partner. And so even relatively low tariff levels or relatively concentrated tariff levels are going to have a significant impact on our trade and therefore on our economy. And of course, at the moment, the British government is having a panic over the fact that we simply do not know what the situation is when it comes to either steel or, more importantly, pharmaceutical tariffs on the UK will have a massive impact on our economy. The other thing that's going on in the world, and this predates Trump, is we've seen, particularly since COVID, but even before, a new wave of protectionism. Protectionism in the form of tariffs with Trump, but protectionism also in the way that both the US and the EU have splashed eye-watering amounts of money, particularly eye-watering amounts of money if, like us, you're a small offshore island that doesn't have the fiscal heft of a continental-sized economy. But these eye-watering sums have been splashed on basically subsidising domestic industries, which of course make life far, far harder for those hoping to access those markets and sell their products in those markets. I mean, to put this succinctly, if the dream of Brexit was a buccaneering trading Britain in a world in which globalization was on speed and everyone was adopting free trade and liberal trading policies, the world has moved in exactly the wrong direction for a country that has chosen to leave the European Union. So that's one set of pressures, which is the economic. The other, which I mentioned right at the start, is the geopolitical. And here the trade-off is quite stark. I mean, if you wanted a graph that kind of summarizes the political economy of Western Europe since the Korean War, that's it. We have basically slashed defence spending to enable us to spend more on welfare and particularly on health. Now, of course, Donald Trump is insisting that NATO allies spend 3.5% of GDP on defence. The UK is hovering at the moment just above 2%, partly because our definitions are a bit dodgy, but anyway, leave that to one side. And Keir Starmer has basically said, we will get to 3.5% in the early part of the next decade. I think the target is around 2032. He's kept it deliberately vague. It'll happen under a new parliament, possibly under a new prime minister, so any pledges he makes aren't really worth anything, but that's the target. But there's one thing worth remembering. The last time our defence spending was anywhere near 3.5% of GDP was towards the end of the 1980s. Towards the end of the 1980s, we spent 4% of our GDP on health. In 2032, when we hope to get to 3.5% of GDP again on defence, health spending will be 9.4% of GDP. So the fact is, geopolitical instability isn't just unstable because we're facing a world in which there are wars. It has massive domestic repercussions because it's going to impose some really, really nasty domestic choices, partly because of that. What that basically shows, I'm sorry, it's a rubbish diagram, but what that basically shows is that the UK has the fatal combination of low growth and high debt interest payments. Rachel Reeves, as everyone knows, going into the forthcoming budget, has a complete and utter lack of fiscal space. Into that lack of fiscal space, you have to factor the need to increase defence spending quite quickly, and the demands of various other departments that are looking for at least stable settlements, if not rises. And of course, all in the context in which we have a governing party that promised not to raise taxes on working people. And one of the saddest and most ridiculous sights in Britain at the moment is the government scurrying around trying to figure out a definition of working people that includes as few people as possible. But talk about stretching credulity. It's one of the things that this government is doing around its fiscal policy. Now, this is all quite bad, but it's actually worse because it's in the context of long-term economic underperformance. Our economy has not been performing that well at all since at least the time of the financial crisis. But if, like me, you think that one of the drivers of poor growth levels is poor productivity levels, our problem actually dates back before the Great Financial Crisis. The UK has struggled to boost productivity for over 20 years now. I remember Gordon Brown in 2005, 2006, organising seminars in number 11 Downing Street to address our productivity crisis. And it's a problem that has stayed with us to this day, and it is one of the major reasons why our growth performance simply doesn't match that of peer economies. And as a result of the lack of growth, and this is perhaps the most horrible slide in a way, median incomes in the United Kingdom have simply not gone up for a very, very long time. Rather than asking why it is that the British people are losing patience with their political leadership, I think the more apposite question is, why is it taking them so long? Because this has been a situation that has dragged on for almost a couple of decades. Now, the democratic reaction to this, we saw last July, the Conservatives lost vote share amongst every class of the population, largely because of their economic record, but it's worse than that. The other thing that we're seeing at the moment is that faith in politics overall has sunk to levels we have never seen before. So in 2023, trust in politics was lower, bless you, than it has ever been since Ipsos started asking questions in 1982. And dissatisfaction can translate into protest. And we saw this with Brexit. That is a really unclear graph that basically tells you that you were more likely to vote Brexit if you came from a place where median wages were low. Okay, so Brexit was partly about values and about sort of worldviews and social liberal versus social conservative. There was an economic element to it, which meant that the poorer parts of the country were disproportionately likely to vote for Brexit. That's a far better way of saying it, but basically tells you, I think I showed you this last time I was here, the places that have a PREP voted to remain. The places that don't have a PREP vote to leave. I mean, and if you're familiar with PREP, you'll know that PREP's basically set up in cities where people are rich, where there's diversity, where actually the economies are doing quite well. That is basically how Brexit panned out. The parts of the country that were doing well, that were feeling self-confident, voted for Remain. The rest didn't. But there's an awful irony to all of this. The idea that the poorer parts of the country voted for something to protest, voted for Brexit to protest, which is that Brexit, of course, had an immediate negative impact on our economy. One of the most striking, I said to you before, that actually one of the drivers of our poor economic performance has been poor productivity. One of the drivers of poor productivity has been the fact that we have always had, certainly over the last 20 years or so, relatively low levels of investment in our country. And those already low levels of investment were absolutely hammered as a result of Brexit. The first casualty of Brexit were levels of investment, which of course feed into productivity, which of course feed into growth. Then, of course, we have the fact that Brexit itself was forecast. And these are the original, the reason why that slide looks a bit dirty is because it's a photocopy of the leaked Treasury forecast from 2017. I hope someone can email these slides around because I see everyone here squinting desperately. The light blue bit at the bottom basically is the bit that says the major cost of being outside the European Union is the cost of being outside the single market. This isn't a question of tariffs, it's a question partly of customs union, but the main economic hit to Brexit resides in being outside the customs union. And however hard we try to sign trade deals with countries around the world, the fact of the matter is, forgive me getting very technical here, we tend to trade more with countries that are closer. You can do what you want with China, with Australia, with New Zealand, with India. The fact of the matter is that making trade with your largest and nearest trading partner more difficult and more expensive is going to have a disproportionate impact. It was true, I think, until 2011, even though George Osborne kept saying it subsequently, that the United Kingdom's trade with the Republic of Ireland was larger than our trade with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa combined. And that's not because the Republic is a huge economy or that it has eye-watering growth rates higher than those in those countries. It is the fact that the Republic is close. And that reality of geography is something we're having to get used to. And of course, all of this, in a sense, the tension between the politics and the economics that Brexit exemplifies, political protest and poor economics that leads to worse economic outcomes, means that there are real tensions now between politics and policy. And one of the clearest ways of seeing that is in the debate about immigration. You can understand why people who voted leave, many of whom voted leave to see reductions in immigration, feel they are let down by the fact that prior to the referendum, in the May of 2016, net immigration into the United Kingdom was 330,000. A year and a half ago, net immigration into the United Kingdom was 795,000. So net immigration more than doubled following a vote that was intended to reduce immigration. And Worse, for some people, I personally think this is a very good thing, the immigrants are different because we're now getting loads of Indians instead of Poles. I mean, I'm all in favour of having more Indians. I think it's great for a country and great for an economy, but you know, people have different views. And the fact of the matter is now we are getting number of people in from India, from Indonesia, from Nigeria. So it's not just the numbers, it's the composition as well. Now, the problem politically with this is it is clear the British people want lower levels of immigration. Problem in terms of policy is that even though immigrants a lot of immigrants do poorly paid jobs that Brits won't do, like working in care, for instance, it is still the case that the average salary of an immigrant is higher than the median of UK people. So cutting immigration is going to have a significant impact on your economy. And this is something we can watch in real time. There's a really good blog on our website this week. It came out on Tuesday, I think, that argues that net immigration numbers are going to collapse because of tightened visa rules and so on over the next couple of years. And that collapse is going to have significant economic consequences. And there's a very clear tension between the requisites of politics, which is to keep immigration low, but the requisites of policy, which are if you want to keep your economy ticking over, you need those levels of immigration. Just a quick word, and I'll make it a very quick word, on Starmer and the reset. I don't doubt for a moment the fact that it's very important that the tone of our relationship, both with the EU and with member states, has changed. If you think about it, it is only just over 3 years ago that the woman who was about to become Prime Minister could not answer the question as to whether France was a friend or a foe. Those days are very, very firmly behind us. And you can see that in the warmth of relationships that are bilateral with member states. You know, just think about state visits and the Republic and the, you know, the closeness of those links. Just think, I think when David Lammy came here, he was the first Foreign Secretary for 7 years to come to the Republic. Those days are behind us. This is a government that sees national interest and political gain in having good, strong, warm relations with its European neighbours. But what that means in substance is a slightly more fraught question, I think. You think back to the summit in May, which was a success in many ways, but the only things that were agreed were a security and defence pact that, to be polite, was boilerplate. It was the same security and defence pact that everyone has, and a deal on fisheries. They were the only two practical achievements, and it's worth bearing in mind that whilst fisheries are politically very salient, fisheries industry contributes less to the UK economy than Harrods on a yearly basis. So, you know, it's not an economic game changer. And there's a lot of stuff to negotiate now, the SPS deal, ETS linkage, youth mobility, and in all those areas, there are potential pitfalls. I'm not saying the negotiations will fail, but I am saying there are real, genuine problems to be addressed. The distance between the two sides when it comes to youth mobility over a cap on numbers, over university fees, over NHS surcharge, all those things remain large. On agriculture, the French are already saying we want wholesale alignment across the piece, which includes things like gene editing, where the British government wants to retain its regulatory autonomy. And when it comes to ETS linkage, the same. The Cabinet Office is saying we don't have to align very much to get to escape the EU CBAM. And of course, people in the EU are saying, you do. There's quite a lot of alignment. So there are potential pitfalls ahead. And even if everything that was agreed at the summit is successfully negotiated, the government's own estimates put the net economic gain in the region of 0.6% of GDP over 10 or 15 years. So compared to that 4%, this is still relatively trivial. And if you think back to that slide about the single market, the major driver of the cost of Brexit remains because, of course, Labour's red line is not rejoining the single market or the customs union. So the reset, even if it works, is not going to have a massive impact on the economics of Brexit. On security, I mean, we can hopefully talk about this in questions a little bit. What I would say, though, is that, I mean, my own personal view is the EU is being a little bit short-sighted, putting considerations of economic market share above considerations of European security in the way it's approaching the negotiations over SAFE. It seems to me an absolute no-brainer. If Europe, defined broadly, not as the EU, wants to achieve greater strategic independence, it is far easier to do so by involving the UK fully than by not. And the attitude on SAFE at the moment indicates that shorter-term considerations of economic gain are taking precedence over longer-term and more serious concerns over security. That being said, At home, the Brits now increasingly say that Brexit was the wrong decision. Poll after poll after poll shows this. Brits increasingly by a majority will say they would vote to rejoin the European Union if asked. This is not, incidentally, because loads of Brits have changed their minds. It is because of what we can politely call demographic churn. Older people were disproportionately likely to vote for Leave. Younger people disproportionately likely to vote for Remain. Some of those older people are no longer with us. And quite a lot of younger people who weren't old enough to vote in 2016 now are. This is because the population is changing. But still, what we see now is a significant proportion of the population who now think that Brexit is having a negative economic impact. But, and this is the big but, whilst the Brits think we've made a bit of a mistake by leaving the European Union, they do not think that UK-EU relations is a priority. Okay, only a couple of % now think that UK-EU relations is the most important issue facing the UK today. And in general, if you do focus groups in the UK, the reaction to mention of the B word is people putting their fingers in the ears and saying, I never want to talk about it again. There's no appetite to revisit the debate. I mean, in a sense, we've arrived at a very, very British position on Brexit. Oh God, we've made a terrible mistake, but actually we can't do much about it, so we're just going to put up with it. That seems to be essentially where public opinion now sits on Brexit. Now you might say, okay, fine, but you've got a government that is sitting on an eye-wateringly huge majority. Why doesn't that government just take some decisive steps to lead public opinion and to actually do something? Well, partly because the government is a little bit cowardly, which again we can talk about in questions, partly too because behind the headline of that massive majority is the fact that Keir Starmer was elected on the lowest vote share ever for a British Prime Minister, under 34% of the vote. I mean, this was first past the post on steroids, working very, very efficiently. My friend and colleague Rob Ford of the University of Manchester wrote a beautiful piece in The Guardian straight after the election in which he said Labour have constructed the tallest and wobbliest electoral Jenga tower, by which he meant they gained votes where they needed them to beat the Conservatives, but lost votes. Let me just skip ahead a couple of slides. Where they were the incumbents, they lost votes. Well, Labour were already holding the seat. Starmer lost 10,000 votes in his constituency. Okay, West Streeting lost a shed load of votes. David Lammy lost votes. If you think back to Tony Blair in Sedgefield in 1997, even though he already had a majority of almost 20,000, he gained 10,000 more. The point is, this wasn't a vote of massive warmth about Labour. This was a vote against incumbency and particularly a vote against the Conservatives. They are Labour voters answering that question, people who voted Labour. And 49% of them are saying, I voted Labour to kick the Tories out, not because I'm keen on Labour. This was, you know, and we see a lot of this across Europe at the moment. This is voting against rather than voting for, which means that the government is less stable than it might appear. Partly because of that, we have far, far more marginal seats now than we've ever had before. And partly too, because we're getting, this was the fragmentation we saw just after the local elections in May. We're now dealing in the United Kingdom with a 5, or in Scotland and Wales, 6-party system. And in an era of volatile voting, of no great attachments to particular parties, if you could win an election on the back of 23 or 24% of the vote, then first past the post becomes a game of Russian roulette. It is an absolute lottery. So the government is nervous because it doesn't feel electorally secure. My argument would be that actually this is the last chance we're going to have in a while to see bold government action, because who knows if we'll ever see a government with a majority of this size again. It is almost the last chance saloon now. This budget is almost the last moment when the government can take drastic, dramatic steps to bring about reform and see some results from it before the next election in 2029. So there are lots of problems there. This is a government that still has the ability to do something about them. The problem is, up to this point, they've shown no inclination to be as bold as they probably need to be. I hope I've cheered you all up.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.